Hello, my name is Carolyn Whitesell. Welcome to my presentation today on ground burrowing rodent biology and management. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Here we go. I'm a human wildlife interactions advisor at University of California's Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And today I'm going to be discussing different management strategies for California ground squirrels. And if time allows, not sure if it will, I'll also mention management tools for gophers as well. So squirrels in California. When you're in the Bay Area and in Santa Clara County, you'll see many squirrels in the trees, and you'll see squirrels on the ground. So here are two common types. So on the left, we have tree squirrels. On the right, we have California ground squirrels. And it's important that you're able to identify them. So you know, if you see squirrels and you want to manage them, it's obviously going to be very different management techniques and what's even allowed depending upon the squirrel species. So how do we tell the difference between a tree squirrel and a ground squirrel? Let's say you see some squirrels on the ground and they see you and they get spooked and they run up. That signifies they're a tree squirrel. Tree squirrels feel safe when they're high up. So even though they may be on the ground, they will retreat up into trees. Ground squirrels, on the other hand, you may see perched on top of a tree. But when you spook them and they get nervous, they're going to run down and they're going to run back to their burrows. So when they're scared, ground squirrels will always return to their burrows. If we look closely at California ground squirrels, we can also see this distinctive white ring around their eye. And they have a whitish saddle on their back as well. And we can also identify them from the damage they do. They have very large incisors, so the front teeth. So you can see here very clearly what their bites look like on an avocado shown to the right. So I'm often faced with this question, and you may be as well, when you're out doing ground squirrel management by members of the public who will ask, well, why can't we just move the animal causing the problem? Well, it would be illegal, and under California regulations, all fur-bearing and non-game mammals that are legal to trap must be immediately killed or released. So you cannot capture a California ground squirrel and move it somewhere else. So relocation of trapped wildlife is prohibited. And that can be helpful to explain to people that it isn't an option to do. And why not? Briefly translocating wildlife, you're forcing those animals to find new food sources in an unfamiliar environment. They also must find new shelter, must avoid predators. They don't know the area. So it really isn't humane to do to them. You may also be moving parents from their offspring. So the offspring will then starve. You could be potentially spreading disease to an area, and bottom line, it's illegal. So if we can't move them, what can we do? And that's where we're going to want to create a management plan. And today, that's what we will be discussing are the different aspects of a plan. So you can pick and choose what's going to make the most sense, both feasibility-wise, logistically, for whatever site you are working at. So current control strategies for ground squirrels. Currently, we focus on an integrated approach that utilizes a number of strategies and tools to control. Some of the common control options, which I will be discussing in detail today, are baiting, fumigation, trapping, biocontrol, and habitat modification. And first off, it's going to be really important to understand the biology and ecology of California ground squirrels as we're deciding when and what control method to use. So you're going to want to use your understanding of biology to guide your management decisions. And for California ground squirrels, this is particularly important because they have throughout the year different times where they're either active or when they're hibernating, in which case different control methods will or will not work. So shown here, they're typically active from January through October. Sometimes they will have a short hibernation called estivation in the summer. So, trapping and baiting will be less effective then. Ground squirrels are going to have 1 litter per year, and the timing of that will depend upon the weather, but they can move to empty burrows any time of the year. So if you have a source population nearby where you're doing your control, you're constantly going to have reinvasion of the area. And that's something to be aware of. And that's why we really view it as managing ground squirrels instead of solving the ground squirrel problem, because it'll be a long-term situation. And it's important when you're deciding on what your management plan is going to be to decide on what threshold of damage you're willing to accept. So at what point do you need to come in and do some of these different control methods? One way to potentially measure threshold could be you could, after going through and doing a control method, you could then cover burrows and see when the holes are opened back up, which would indicate that new squirrels have moved back in. So that's just something to think about long-term as you're guiding your management. So here we have a really helpful chart that shows up at top each month of the year. And then on the left here, at the top, we have adult ground squirrel activity and then juvenile activity. So you can see here, when we're looking at both adults and juveniles, when it's gray, that means they're hibernating, which means that many of these control methods will not be effective. And you can also see when they're mating there. And then underneath the adult activity and juvenile activity, we can see what their diet is, because that also varies through the year. So from mid-January through mid-May, that's when ground squirrels are mostly going to be focusing on green forage before things dry out and they start eating seeds. Why this is important is that's directly related to the effectiveness of toxic baits. So when there's green forage available, the ground squirrels aren't going to be very interested in your baits. So you really want to use those toxic baits at the time of year when ground squirrels are eating seeds. And then for fumigation, this is going to be most effective when ground squirrels are active. So you don't want to fumigate when they're still hibernating because it will not be effective at all. And fumigation is also going to be more effective when the soil is moist. So when we have some of this rain coming through, but once the soil starts being very dry, we're not going to have the same efficacy for fumigation. And you can also see for these other methods, such as trapping, there's a bit of a wider period of time through the year when that is effective. And I would highly recommend that as you're formulating your management plan, feel free to visit the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website. So if you just Google this, it'll be the top search. And this is a really fantastic website that's going to go through the biology, identification, different management options for California ground squirrels, what the regulations are, and it'll also provide these really handy charts that I'll be showing. So we have that same one that we looked at earlier. We also, it goes through the different management methods and their efficacy, but also looks at cost and labor, as well as restrictions. So then you can see what will be a good fit for your the property you're working on. So there are a lot of rules and regulations around the use of toxic baits and burrowing rodents that are going to be really important to understand. If at any point you aren't sure about what permits you're going to need, check with your local ag department. The local agricultural department, that's who administers the fines. So they're going to know all of the rules and regulations, and they'll be able to help you understand what all you will need to secure. So here we have a list. Hopefully you can see it under the screen sharing icon. It says California restricted materials requirements. And so here we have a list of the different California restricted materials. And the ones that we'll be discussing today are aluminum phosphide, which is a gas that is effective with ground squirrels, highly effective with gophers. I'll also be if we get to gophers, I'll be mentioning strychnine, which is allowed for gophers, but not for California ground squirrels. I'll also be discussing zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxin that is a bait. And of course, products labeled only for one or more of the following uses: home use, structural pest control, industrial use, institutional use, public agency, vector control district. So just make sure if you're interested in using any of these materials that you are allowed to. Now, for a restricted materials permit, so if you're going to be using these restricted materials, you'll need a permit to. That's going to be the responsibility of the owner of the property or the business operator. They're the ones that need to go through and secure this permit. However, it is your responsibility to check that before you apply a restricted use material, that the owner of the property has the material listed on their permit. So you, not the property owner, will receive the violation. So it's really important that you make sure the property owner has secured this permit, because you do not want to get in trouble. You're also going to need to give an NOI, or notice of intent, to your county ag commissioner's department at least 24 hours before the application of a restricted use material. Now, the applicator has up to 4 days after the planned date, which is the date on the notice, to begin the application. If the pesticide application is not started in 4 days, a new notice of intent must be filed. And this is really important because, as I'll go over, weather can have to do with whether you're going to be putting out some of these baits or not. So maybe you had planned to do an application, but then a huge storm rolls in for a week, which delays your ability to go out and do the application, in which case you're going to need to get a new notice of intent filed. So keep that in mind. You're also going to need a written recommendation for the application of any pesticide on any production or non-production agricultural site. And one copy of this recommendation needs to be signed and dated, and needs to be given to the operator of the property before the application. You're also going to want to give a copy to the dealer and the applicator prior to the application of the pesticide. Perhaps most importantly, you must have a copy of the label. So every pesticide is going to have a label on it, and you need to have a copy of the label with you whenever you are applying that pesticide. Now, it can be virtual, so electronic, so you could have it on your phone, but really this is to help protect you. So you want to have immediate access to it. So probably, having a printed copy is ideal. And the reason why this is so important for your own health and safety is it will give very detailed instructions on how to use the pesticide, and also what to do if you, get it in your eyes, or if you accidentally ingest any. If you have a situation that's potentially dangerous, what do you need to do? It'll also have as we see here on the left, it has a note to physician. So you could, if you accidentally ingest it and you need to see a doctor, you can give them the label and they'll know exactly what you've ingested. So that's going to be really important for you. Of course, we also need to consider endangered species that may be on the property where you're wanting to use any of these pesticides. In the Bay Area and in Santa Clara, as you guys I'm sure are aware, we have the burrowing owl, tiger salamander, some other species you're going to need to be aware of. And what you can do if you have your property, you're wanting to use pesticides on it, you can go to the California Department of Pesticide Regulation Prescribe website. And this website is going to let you know what species of concern are present in your area. And it's also going to describe the limitations on bait application per active ingredient or product. And this is what the website looks like. So you would go to prescribe, you would put in your county and put in where you are, and it will then search and let you know what the potential species are that you need to be aware of. And sometimes prescribe, if you don't know how to use it exactly, or if you're still not sure, again, contact your county ag office. They can either talk you through prescribe, or they should also have a good sense of what endangered species you may have to look out for. Or if you work in a county office, ask a colleague. I'm sure someone in your office will have an idea of which species you need to be aware of. All right, so baiting. When is baiting going to be effective? When do we want to put out toxic baits? And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be most effective when ground squirrels are going after seeds. So typically from end of May through October. There are two main kinds of baits. There are anticoagulants, and there's an acute toxicant named zinc phosphide. And depending upon which you use, there are going to be different rules and ways to apply them. So for anticoagulants, there are two types. There are first generation and second generation. The use of second generation anticoagulants is not permitted in California ground squirrel management. So you may have heard of these toxicants, but you cannot use second generation for California ground squirrels. And that's because, or compared to first generation anticoagulant associated risks, the secondary toxicity risks are significantly greater when we're using second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So given that, you are able to use first generation options. And the two types of first generation options are chlorofazanone and difazanone. And these are now restricted use. So for these first generation anticoagulants, they can be used for spot treatments, broadcast, or in bait stations. And to work, these are going to require multiple feedings. There is an antidote available for these, but if you have any concerns at all about what is going to be ingesting this, you shouldn't apply it, because even though there's an antidote available, it isn't 100% effective. So you can't rely on the possibility of using an antidote. Do you want to mention bait stations are going to have their own set of rules as well. So make sure you read through those for whichever bait you're using. And you're always going to want to check for and collect carcasses on a regular basis. Here's an example of some of these labels. Here we have different examples, and they'll say whether they have structural use or if they can be used in bait stations and exactly how to go about using them. So always make sure you thoroughly read the label. And on that ground squirrel best management practices website I mentioned earlier, they also have a really great step-by-step guide on how to create your own bait station if you don't want to buy one that's pre-made for you. Okay, so our other option is the acute toxin named zinc phosphide. This bait's going to have a strong garlic odor. It must be used by a licensed professional. There is the potential for bait shyness with this toxin. It can be used for spot treatments and broadcast baiting, but it cannot be used for bait stations. So this is a really important difference. Make sure you are not using a bait station with zinc phosphide. It's also not permitted for use in or around buildings. And the label is very species specific for many locations. So make sure you read carefully. Squirrel will be permitted in some areas, but not in others. So you're going to need to see, is the location where you want to use it allowed or not? So here we have some of those lists, use restrictions. So for California ground squirrels, you can see there. And you also want to read the label to learn what they recommend for pre-baiting. It is recommended to pre-bait for zinc phosphide. Sometimes it's a label requirement. Again, read the label and have one with you. And one of the advantages of pre-baiting, besides that it may be required by the label, is that you are able to then check to see if non-targets are eating the bait. You can also double check if adult ground squirrels are eating the bait. And here again, we have a comparison between first generation anticoagulant rodenticides and zinc phosphide. So you can see here, FGARs, highly effective. For zinc phosphide, precipitation and other factors may influence the efficacy. So you don't want to put out zinc phosphide when it's raining. We also have really good bait acceptance for first generation anticoagulants. Bait acceptance can be more variable with zinc phosphide. While there is an antidote available for first generations, for zinc phosphide, there is no antidote available. And for primary toxicity, first generation anticoagulants will have a lower non-target risk, whereas zinc phosphide, being an acute toxin, can have very high non-target risks. And for secondary toxicity, there's some potential for risk for first generation anticoagulants. There's essentially no risk for zinc phosphide. And there will be differences in cost and time to death, as well as restrictions. So consider all of this when you're deciding what you would like to use if you are going the route of applying toxic baits. All right, so on to fumigation. So this is going to involve the use of poison gas in burrows to control ground squirrels. And if we look to the right on the chart of when is it going to be most effective, it's when ground squirrels are active, but the soil is moist. So especially in Northern California, right, rains can be a bit variable, especially these days. So that this can vary a bit. Maybe we have some late rains and you can actually do fumigation a little bit later, but keep an eye on what the soil moisture level is. And fumigants should not be used around buildings. So that's going to be a limitation depending upon what your site looks like. And of course, you're not wanting to fumigate when ground squirrels are hibernating, but also not when they're estivating. And if you arrive at the site ready to fumigate, you're going to want to scare the ground squirrels into their burrows, right? Because that's where you're going to be treating, is within the burrows. So, potentially walking around, trying to do something to get the ground squirrels to hide down in their burrows. And of course, read the label of the fumigant you're using to know what specific criteria of where it can be used. So exactly, how many feet from a building, et cetera, to make sure that you're following those rules and regulations. So there are different types of fumigation. We can do gas cartridges, aluminum phosphide, carbon monoxide, and we can also use pressure. And whenever we're fumigating, you're going to need a written site-specific fumigation management plan. And you need to post a warning sign such as this to alert people that fumigation is in progress. So gas cartridges you can get from a hardware supply, so you don't require a license because it's not a restricted use material. And they're fairly effective. In general, when we're talking about management, our management goal, that threshold we're trying to reach of how many individuals within a population are removed is 70%. So that's the number we're aiming for. And as you can see, for gas cartridges, there's a range. It's around 70%. So it's fairly effective. The active ingredients of gas cartridges are sodium nitrate and charcoal. Some also are going to contain sulfur. And that's going to create carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, if it has sulfur when we light it. You do want to be careful, especially in Northern California, about fire hazards, right? You are lighting a fuse on these gas cartridges. So be aware of that. If it's really dry conditions, we don't want to start a wildfire. And what you're going to do is you're going to, not like these photos, you're going to put the fuse into the burrow first and light it. And you want to make sure that you've plugged the other entrances to the burrow, with newspaper or something, so that the gas is contained within the burrow. Then we have aluminum phosphide. This is a restricted material. Oh, sorry. And that means it's going to require a restricted use permit to both purchase and to use. You must also be a qualified applicator or be supervised by a qualified applicator in order to use aluminum phosphide. For this, a really important thing to remember is that you cannot use aluminum phosphide when it's actively precipitating. So when it's raining, you cannot use aluminum phosphide. And that's because it's actually, the whole mechanism is that it reacts with moisture in the air. And you can get aluminum phosphide either in the form of tablets or pellets. And they release phosphine gas, which then when it gets inhaled by the ground squirrels, it enters the bloodstream. An added benefit of using aluminum phosphide is that it will also control flea populations that are within the burrow. And so, that's an added utility that not all other management tools also provide. So you're able to not only control the ground squirrels, but also any fleas that they have on them and in the burrow system. And you need to be very careful with aluminum phosphide. It can be dangerous. You really need to cover the other burrow entrances. You need to follow the label and make sure that you are following all of the restrictions. It can only be used out of doors for control of burrowing pests and they have a whole list of what kinds of properties. So of course, before you use it, you need to make sure that your area does qualify. And the use of aluminum phosphide is going to be heavily restricted by location and also proximity to people and domestic animals. For the application, you're going to put either 2 to 4 tablets or 10 to 20 pellets as far down into the burrow as you can. You'll then seal up the burrow, with newspaper or some other similar material, and then cover those entrances with soil, because you really want to prevent the gas from escaping through the burrow entrance. And you're, of course, only going to want to treat active burrow systems because anything that is in the burrow will be affected. Aluminum phosphide cannot be applied on school grounds except for athletic fields. Can only be applied in burrow systems that are more than 100 feet from a building that is or may be inhabited by people or domestic animals. It can be applied in athletic fields or parks associated with schools. And, just to really highlight how careful you want to be, there have been tragedies in the US and internationally where, aluminum phosphide hasn't been handled correctly and it has resulted in deaths. So please be very careful as you're storing and as you're using aluminum phosphide. And of course, you're going to need to post a sign letting people know that you have a fumigation management plan and that fumigation is underway. All right, then on to carbon monoxide, which is another technique of fumigation. Potential advantages for carbon monoxide are, some argue it's safer to use. You can use the same machine for multiple applications. It will now be regulated by CDPR. I'm not aware yet that they have started or created any new regulations, but keep your eye out. Those are coming. And of course, then you'll want to be paying close attention to what those regulations are in relation to carbon monoxide. There are a few different machines, or brands, so like Cheetah shown here up top, and then that bottom machine is called a PERC machine. And they have been tested with various results. I think I have here we go. Some of these results of studies that have been done using these different machines. The Cheetah at the time of this study was found to not be effective. But as far as I'm aware, the company's constantly trying to improve things. So maybe that has changed. The PERC machine was found to be highly effective, and actually even in dry soil, the efficacy was quite high, whereas in moist soil, near 100%. So that does seem to work very well. And typical application time, is 3 to 6 minutes. I mean, it'll depend on the size of the burrow system. But also, we go back and look at the PERC machine down here. Depending upon what size PERC machine you get, there'll be different numbers of hoses attached to it. So you could potentially be working on multiple burrows at once. So, but then it's a bigger machine that you have to haul. So that'll, think through access to the property where you're trying to use carbon monoxide machines. How are you going to get them out to where these burrows are? How many people do you have available? It's only doesn't help if you have way more hoses than people to deploy them and to actually do the fumigation on these burrows. So those are just different aspects to consider when deciding if and which company to go with for carbon monoxide machines. We then have a device called the rotinator, which is a gas explosive device. And this is actually going to use concussive force to collapse a burrow system. So you can see here it being used, and you can see the burrow literally exploding. Big caveat and warning, it does pose a fire risk. You need to be really careful that you don't accidentally start a fire. So keep that in mind. It's also incredibly loud. So if you're near an urban or even suburban center, it sounds like an explosion because it is a concussive force in the burrows. So may not be the best tool if you're near a lot of people. If you, much more rural area, much further from your neighbors, you don't think there's any fire risk, then, potentially could use this as an option. All right. Then moving on to trapping. So trapping, control of small populations of ground squirrels is possible with traps. It'll be challenging if you have a very large population of ground squirrels to use trapping as your knockdown method. Probably not going to work as well. But if we use some other method to do a knockdown, then we can continue using trapping to maintain that lower population. Or if we don't have a huge population to start off with, then you can use trapping as your control method. It's going to be effective during times of year when ground squirrels are not hibernating and also when they're not estivating. So the estivation can happen when it's really hot in the summer. So trapping is, effective for most of the year, except during those 2 times. So who can trap damaging ground squirrels? If you're trapping for profit, you're going to need a trapping license. If you're the homeowner, you will not require a trapping license. County employees don't need a trapping license, but they do need notices and written recommendations. So there are lots of different types of traps that are available. So we have body gripping traps, tube traps, box type squeeze traps. Those are kind of the 3 most common, or common kill traps at least. Wire cage traps are common live traps, like what we see in this bottom photo. But do keep in mind that if you use a live trap and capture ground squirrels, you're going to be required to euthanize them, right? Live traps require euthanization of vertebrate pests. And I hear a lot of people saying, oh, I can drown them. No drowning. That is not a legal way of euthanasia. And I'll touch upon euthanasia a bit later if there's time. But keep in mind, drowning is not an option, even though I know in my work, I often hear people mistakenly thinking that is allowed. And of course, whenever you are handling traps, please always wear gloves. Even if the trap is empty, you want to keep yourself safe, please wear gloves. Don't put traps with animals inside your vehicle. You never know if somehow the trap is going to get opened. So please be safe. Here's an example of a few of these traps. So quite a large live trap here on the left. So some brands you may have heard are like Black Fox Trap or Squirrelinator. And for multi-catch traps, like this one on the left, you're going to need to pre-bait them. So you can use a very high value bait like melon during the green forage time of year. During when more seeds might not need quite as high value, but just see what the squirrels are interested in at your location. It's going to vary. And you need to be really careful about where you place the trap. You don't want to leave it in full sun. So I know people will either place it in shade or they'll create shade by putting like a piece of plywood over the trap, because you don't want any animals that are caught inside, to get overheated. That's cruel. You don't want to leave them out in the sun. And you also want to be careful that other predators aren't able to reach in and attack any squirrels that are caught either. So be cognizant of that in trap placement. Now, for pre-baiting, you're also going to need to be careful, and baiting in general, whenever you're putting the bait inside the trap, be really careful about where your placement is. Ground squirrels are very clever, and they often will figure out how they can reach in and get the bait without setting off the trap. And I've heard some great stories about squirrels, they're like propping the door open with their tail and reaching all the way in and grabbing the food and then escaping. So they're very smart. You just need to outsmart them. Think through where you can put the bait so that they can get it and not be able to escape. Although, if you're pre-baiting, then of course we'll prop the gate or the the door open, so they do get used to going in and out of the trap. And an added benefit to pre-baiting, where we're getting the squirrels accustomed to having this trap going in, they aren't worried about it, is because remember, ideally we want to capture the big adult mature ground squirrels, right? And just like people, the mature adults are going to be a little smarter, more wary, whereas we have the juvenile ground squirrels that are going to be less cautious and more likely to go into your trap. But you want to capture all age classes, because if you're only capturing the juvenile ground squirrels, it's not going to be very effective for control. So pre-baiting and putting some high value food in to help those adult, older ground squirrels get comfortable with the trap will increase your odds of capturing those older ones. And really, your goal should be to capture those old, mature ground squirrels, because they themselves will act as bait. So if you capture an alpha ground squirrel, they're going to call within the trap, and they can call the rest of the ground, or many more ground squirrels in. So you can capture quite a few in one go if you're careful about placement, do a good job pre-baiting, and make sure you have bait in the right location within the trap, and that it's bait that the squirrels are interested in on that at that location and at that time of year. So a conibear trap, like seen here to the right, that can be placed at burrow entrances. They can also be placed inside boxes in an attempt to exclude larger animals. These are very effective traps, but they will kill non-target species. And you don't have the option to release them, whereas in a live trap, you would be able to release a non-target. They're also, conibear traps are very powerful. So they could easily break a little kid's arm. So, these are very tightly sprung traps. You want to be careful. If you are at all worried about, non-target species or members of the public getting into one of these traps, don't use it. Of course, use gloves, be careful in setting these. You don't want to capture yourselves. And I guess in today's era, we're all better about hygiene and wearing gloves, but please continue wearing gloves when we're dealing with any kinds of traps. All right, getting to one of our last control options for ground squirrels. So habitat modification. This is going to involve altering habitat to reduce the desirability for pests. So for example, we could remove brush piles to control ground squirrels. We can try to destroy old burrows. There is a product named the burrow blocker, the idea being that it fills in these ground squirrel burrows with this like sand and water mixture. Again, with water being so limited in California, that could be a potential negative or make it not possible to use, but it is something to consider if that's something you're interested in doing. It's a huge machine, so the cost and logistics of it, so it does have more limited site suitability than some of the other options. And then lastly, biocontrol. So natural predators have been used to control vertebrate pests. This tends to be, more popular with the public than some other control methods. However, owl boxes are not going to be appropriate for ground squirrels, because owls are going to be hunting at night when ground squirrels aren't active. And unfortunately, raptor perches, as of now, the research, suggests that they're ineffective. So they can't hurt, they can only help. It's always good to have more raptors in your area, but unfortunately, as of now, I wouldn't recommend using raptor perches as your main control method. It's probably not going to work. but it can always help as an added technique on top of your other control methods. All right, so let's see. I have about 15 minutes left, so perfect. So I will go ahead and move on to gophers. And then I'll come back to this slide if anyone wants to take down my contact information. If you ever have any questions, feel free to either email me or give me a call, and I'll be happy to talk through and see how I can help with creating your management plan. All right, so gophers. Considerable research in the last 10 years has been done on gophers. And interestingly, much of it has been carried out in California, which is fantastic. So typical gopher mounds are going to look like this. So we have this hole, and then we have this kind of like horseshoe shape mound to one side of it. Now, when there's been a lot of wind or rain, or it's an older hole, that mound can get washed away or blown off. So then you can just be left with a plain burrow, just the plain hole. Now, oftentimes people will get confused between gopher mounds and mole mounds. So a distinctive feature between them is that mole mounds will look like this because they're going to dig directly down into the soil. So as they're digging and making their hole, they're going to be kicking out dirt directly up. So we have this mound here that's covering the burrow, and it's evenly around it. Whereas the gophers, when they dig down, they're going to be spraying dirt behind them at a 45-degree angle. So we have this angular burrow, and then that's why we saw that kind of horseshoe shape dirt mound to one side of the hole. So that's the first thing you're going to want to look for if you're trying to decide if you have a mole or a gopher issue on your property. And gophers, though they are small, they are also very destructive. And the estimated loss in revenue in agriculture is very large. Especially alfalfa here, it can get pretty hammered by gophers. Now, estimates of losses and costs in the urban environment, those are unknown, but I would not be surprised if they are also up there. They can do quite a bit of damage. And it's not only damage itself, but also liability. So depending on what type of property you have, if you have members of the public, or that's, kids playing sports on it, let's say someone, steps into one of these burrows and hurts their ankle, there's potentially associated liability with that. So that is something to keep in mind. It's not only the direct damage that burrows can cause, but also the liability. So when we're looking at what our management options are for gophers, again, we're going to want to use an integrated approach. And in terms of different options and what is effective and what is not, we have habitat modification, we have baiting, we have burrow fumigation, we have trapping, and we have exclusion. And those are all management options that have been shown to be effective, though to varying degrees. And that's what I'll be briefly talking about. So habitat modification. When you're returfing or you're going to be replowing a field, this could be an option where we're deep disking or ripping into the ground. So it's not generally an option in urban California, but if we're talking about larger ag fields, this could potentially be an option where we're really digging down 12 to 18 inches into the soil to try to destroy these burrows. Exclusion. So if we have high value plants, we could put baskets around them, like gopher wire, gopher cloth, to try to prevent the gophers from accessing those high value plants. So there is underground fencing you can buy, hardware cloth, sorry, not gopher cloth, hardware cloth, and wire mesh you're just going to want to make sure it's, between 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. And you can potentially, if you're, redoing a garden, you could lay this down, or if you have like planter boxes, you could put this at the bottom. But again, you'll need to look at the economic feasibility depending upon how large the area is that you're trying to keep gophers out of. For baiting, it's mostly restricted use in California unless it's by the homeowner. So the options that we have are anticoagulants, zinc phosphide, and for gophers, we do have access to strychnine, whereas remember that is not allowed for California ground squirrels. You're only going to want to place bait underground. That's really important. And I would recommend avoiding using it in gardens with root vegetables. So be aware of what it is that you're growing on the property. So strychnine is an acute toxicant, and it's actually the preferred bait for controlling gophers given its acute toxicity. It's more palatable than zinc phosphide. It's very effective, if the gophers eat it. There has been some behavioral resistance to strychnine baits, so that's where gophers will just eat a little bit of it and then be fine. And that's perhaps the biggest shortcoming of using strychnine is that there's currently a shortage of strychnine baits in the US. And actually, Wilco, who has been the primary importer of strychnine for pest control purposes into the US, recently stopped importing strychnine and has halted production of strychnine. So this will already potentially be quite difficult to find, and that will just become more so. All right, so then we also have zinc phosphide. And for this, you're going to need a license. Remember, as we discussed earlier, it is an acute toxicant. It can also be effective, something to be aware of. Gophers can develop bait shyness to this, but it's much more readily available than strychnine. We again also have anticoagulant rodenticides. So the same 2-diphacinone and chlorofazanone that I mentioned for ground squirrels can also be used for gophers. And it's a relatively low risk of secondary toxicosis because the gophers tend to die in their burrows underground. First generation anticoagulants, remember, are going to require multiple feedings. So that's something to be aware of. And, if you're worried about the primary toxicity from other products, you might want to go this route where we do have that low risk of secondary toxicosis. When we're using bait for gophers, you're going to want to use a bait probe or a metal rod. And this is actually, this first step is true for either applying bait or if we're going to set traps. So first we need to figure out where the burrows are and where these kind of main tunnels are underground. So that's why using this bait probe or metal rod is going to be really helpful. So using this thin rod, you're going to be probing 6 to 12 inches deep to try to locate the main tunnel. And this is going to take some experience to know what that feels like. You'll feel it'll give when you hit the main tunnel. It'll suddenly slide through the soil easily. And then you'll know you've hit that tunnel there, which is what you're aiming for. And so if you're using bait, you'll then drop whatever the label recommends into the tunnel and then cover the hole to back to that tunnel system. And again, check the label, but you're going to want to potentially make a few treatments per burrow system. And you're going to want to maintain a constant supply of bait in the burrow system for as long as there is gopher activity. And make sure for gophers, do not apply bait on the surface of the soil. Keep it within their tunnels. And you want to make sure that the bait is in the main runway, not in the laterals or embedded in the bottom of the runway. So here we have this figure, so you can see that main burrow system, the main run, deeper down, and the burrow system will have these like ancillary tunnels going up to the surface. And that's where, you know, experience will really help for being able to feel the difference there. And typically these lateral tunnels will be at an angle, whereas the main burrow system will be more horizontal along the ground. And that's what the gophers are using much more. So, you know, that's what you're aiming for. That'll be the most likely to encounter the gophers. So here kind of is a step-by-step of what that looks like. So step one, we're opening the burrow. So there he is digging a hole. Of course, at this point, he's already, you know, probed and discovered it. Then second step is putting the bait in the burrow, and then we're going to close the burrow back up. All right, and then we can also use fumigation for gophers as well as ground squirrels. And for gas cartridges, however, while they're effective for ground squirrels, they are not effective for gophers, which means if you're wanting to do fumigation, aluminum phosphide is going to be a better bet than gas cartridges. Aluminum phosphide is highly effective for gophers, but it is a restricted use pesticide. You could also use carbon monoxide for gophers as well. And the same applies in terms of being careful about, you know, making sure you're reading the label, making sure you're doing it in a place where it's allowed. Well, read the label as soon as these rules and regulations as well are published by DPR. And I'm not aware of as many studies on in terms of the cheetah machine, mostly the perk for gophers. But again, keep in mind what your different scenarios are, what labor you have available to you, the ease of access for these different machines to the property, and how many burrows you're trying to treat. All right. And then we also have trapping, and this is perhaps, at least for homeowners, what tends to be the most common I've found in terms of dealing with gopher issues. So there's been quite a lot of research on this, which is really fascinating. So we've looked, our scientific community, including some colleagues in California, have looked at Maccabee versus Gophinator. These are two brands of traps you may have heard of. Also looked at, you know, whether you need to cover or uncover when you place these traps in the burrows, using an attractant versus no attractant at these traps. Does the person who's putting these traps in need to be trained versus an untrained individual? And then gloves versus no gloves. You know, does the human scent on the trap affect its efficacy? And then above ground traps versus in tunnel traps. So quickly, Maccabee versus Gophinator, these are these two brands. The Gophinator, very powerful trap. It's going to grip the animal high up on the body. The trigger arm offset to prevent the upward pressure on gophers. And the idea being you don't want to like throw the gopher out of the trap when it is set. And it has that rotating pincher arm that clamps the stationary arm. And if you buy these traps and you're not sure how to use them, you can go online. There are lots of videos that'll step through how to actually set them. And so the Gophinator, with that rotating pincher arm, has a more secure capture. So when researchers were comparing these two traps, they found that while they both capture gophers, the Gophinator captured larger gophers, or more gophers and larger gophers. And that was across seasons. There also is going to be, I'll just briefly mention, 15 more seconds. Covered versus uncovered, there was not a statistical difference in efficacy. Same with attractant versus no attractant. I know some people really swear by using an attractant in a trap, but scientifically was not shown to be a big difference. Trained versus untrained. So at first, there is going to be a statistically different effectiveness for how the person is setting out the trap. But after, a few days, an inexperienced person can quickly become a very good trapper. And over time, that difference will become minimized. So training does matter in terms of your rate of gopher capture. And a lot of that work was done by Roger Baldwin, who's also a UC Cooperative Extension specialist. Just briefly to wrap up, when we're talking traps, and again, just want to mention this because they're so commonly used, things to consider are going to be, not only efficacy of the individual trap, but also how much turf damage you're willing to have happen. Some of these traps are going to require you to, expand a hole to get the trap down into the burrow, so there can be more turf damage there. Traps that use less turf damage are like a cinch trap and a gopher hawk. So things to consider with that. All right, and then, so I don't want to take up any more time past the hour. Let me just get back to my contact information. Here we go. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you learned something new. And again, if there's anything I didn't have time to get to or anything that needs clarification, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.